Nobody expected that courtroom moment to go the way it did. What should have been just another hearing suddenly turned into the kind of scene people don't forget, because the second King Harris's girlfriend started speaking, the entire energy in the room reportedly changed. At first, it looked like she was trying to hold herself together. She stood there, visibly emotional, trying to stay composed, trying to say what she came there to say without losing control. But then something shifted, and once it did, there was no pulling it back. According to people who have been discussing what happened, this wasn't just a witness giving short answers and moving on. This was personal. This was emotional. And more importantly, this allegedly came from someone close enough to the situation to make people stop and pay attention. Because when a person on the outside talks, people listen with caution. But when someone from the inside starts speaking, people listen differently. That's what made this moment hit so hard. The woman at the center of it wasn't some random voice commenting from a distance. She was reportedly close enough to know what happened behind the scenes, close enough to see things the public never saw, and close enough for her words to instantly carry weight. And once people realized that, the entire tone of the hearing reportedly changed. What had started as a controlled legal moment suddenly felt unpredictable. And that's when the real questions began. Because if someone that close starts breaking down in court, was it just emotion taking over? Or was it the kind of breakdown that only happens when someone has been carrying something for a long time? That's the question people can't stop asking. Because one thing is clear, whatever happened in that room didn't look small. It didn't feel casual, and it definitely didn't feel like something people would forget by the next day. Now, to understand why this moment is getting so much attention, you have to look at the bigger picture. King Harris has never exactly been a quiet presence. He's outspoken, confident, and the kind of person who naturally pulls attention toward himself. Whether people support him or criticize him, he's never been the type to go unnoticed. But that kind of personality can also create pressure, especially when personal problems start becoming public problems. And that's where this story starts getting complicated. Because from the outside, people only ever see fragments. A clip here, a rumor there, a reaction online, but real situations don't unfold in fragments. They build behind closed doors. Quietly, slowly, sometimes for much longer than anybody realizes. And according to the way this story is being discussed, that may be exactly what happened here. His girlfriend wasn't someone who had always been front and center. She wasn't the face of the story. She wasn't the one dominating headlines. But in situations like this, the person speaking the least publicly can sometimes be the one holding the most information. And if that's true, then her words in that courtroom mattered even more than people first realized. Reports and online reactions suggest there may have already been tension leading up to that hearing. Not necessarily public tension. Not necessarily something people could point to immediately. But the kind of tension that builds in private until one moment finally forces everything out into the open. And once that happens, the story stops being about appearances and starts becoming about what was really happening underneath all of it. That's why people keep calling this a turning point. Because according to those following the situation, there was a moment during her testimony when this stopped feeling like a standard court proceeding and started feeling like a direct confrontation. The details remain unclear, and no exact quote seems fully confirmed, but multiple retellings describe the same basic shift. At one point, she allegedly stopped speaking generally and started speaking directly toward King Harris himself. And if that really happened, then that changes everything. Because there's a huge difference between speaking to a courtroom and speaking to a person. One is procedure, the other is personal. One follows structure, the other cuts straight through it. And once a hearing crosses into that kind of territory, the atmosphere changes immediately. It no longer feels like a distant legal exchange. It feels raw. It feels exposed. It feels like something real just broke through the surface. That's also where T.I.'s presence becomes impossible to ignore. Because this story isn't just about one relationship. It's also about family, image, pressure, and the weight that comes when something private begins spilling into public view. T.I. wasn't just another face in the room. He was there as a father, as a public figure, and as someone whose reaction would naturally be watched the second the situation became more serious. And according to people discussing the moment, his reaction did not go unnoticed. Up until that point, the impression was that he had remained calm and controlled, observing, listening, holding his composure. But some accounts say that after she reached that emotional turning point, his demeanor seemed to change, not with some loud outburst, not with a dramatic interruption, just a subtle shift, enough for people in the room to notice, enough for observers to start asking what exactly had just been said to cause that kind of reaction. And sometimes that's what makes a moment more powerful than words ever could. It's not always the loud reaction that sticks with people. Sometimes it's the silence. Sometimes it's the stillness. Sometimes it's the look on someone's face when they realize a situation is heavier than it first appeared. And from the way this story is being repeated online, that may have been exactly what happened in that room. But then the story reportedly took another turn. Because once the emotions settled in, the focus allegedly shifted towards something even more serious. The possibility that what was being said wasn't just emotional, but potentially tied to something that could be backed up. And that's where the weight of the whole situation reportedly changed. Because people can dismiss emotion if they want to. They can argue about perspective. They can debate motive. But the second any conversation starts moving toward proof, whether partial, disputed, or still unclear, the entire atmosphere gets heavier. According to multiple discussions around the hearing, something may have been referenced that made people in the room feel this was no longer just about how someone felt. It was now about what could potentially be challenged, confirmed, or examined more deeply. The exact details still remain muddy. Some say one thing, others say another. But the one detail that keeps repeating is simple: whatever was brought up changed the room. And once that happened, people reportedly stopped looking at this like just another emotional courtroom moment. Now it felt bigger. Now it felt like one of those moments where everyone present understood they might be watching the direction of the entire situation change in real time. Because once testimony starts colliding with the suggestion of evidence, there's no easy way to shrink the story back down again. It expands. Fast. And that appears to be exactly why people are still talking about it. But here, where the story gets even more divided. Because outside that courtroom, the internet immediately split into two sides. One side looked at her breakdown and said this was someone finally reaching her limit, someone who had been holding something in until the pressure became too much. The other side pushed back just as hard, saying emotion does not automatically mean truth, and that no one should rush to conclusions without full context. And honestly, that divide is probably why this story keeps growing. Because people aren't just reacting to what happened, they're reacting to what they believe happened. And those are not always the same thing. One group sees a woman breaking down and thinks that kind of reaction doesn't happen for no reason. Another group sees a dramatic moment and insists there are still too many missing pieces to treat it as proof of anything. So now the story lives in that tension between emotion and interpretation. And that tension only got worse because of what happened next: silence. No major clarification, no immediate effort to publicly explain the full situation, no obvious attempt to put all the rumors to rest, just silence from the people at the center of it. And when something this public is followed by that kind of silence, people start reading into everything. They notice the lack of statements. They notice the distance. They notice the absence of normal public behavior. And that silence starts speaking for itself. Because in situations like this, people often rush to defend themselves, explain themselves, or control the narrative. But when that doesn't happen, the public starts assuming one of two things. Either there's more going on behind the scenes, or the people involved know that whatever comes next could make the situation even more serious. Either way, the quiet doesn't calm the story down. It makes it louder. That's why this doesn't feel finished. It feels like one piece of a much larger situation that still hasn't fully come into view. The courtroom moment may have been the spark, but it clearly wasn't the whole fire. And that's what keeps people locked in. Not just what was said, but what led to it. Not just the breakdown itself, but the possibility that this emotional moment was the result of something building in private for a long time. Because if what happened in that courtroom was only the first visible crack in a much bigger story, then the public is still missing the part that matters most. And maybe that's the real reason this moment won't go away. It isn't because people have all the answers, it's because they don't. There are too many gaps, too many reactions, Too many subtle details, too much silence where people expected explanation. And until those missing pieces show up, every expression, every pause, and every report from inside that room is going to keep getting replayed over and over again. So at this point, maybe the biggest question isn't what she said. Maybe the biggest question is what happened before she ever said it. Because if that truth ever comes fully to light, it could completely change how people see this entire situation. And until then, this remains one of those stories that feels suspended in the middle, not over, not resolved, and definitely not forgot. And that's why all eyes are still on what happens next.